Welcome back to the 12 Days of Christmas. We've been looking at the various characters in the Christmas story, and there's a number of characters that we would call unspoken, or characters that find themselves in the story, but the Bible doesn't really tell us a lot about them. It assumes certain things about them. And one of the places where we find those characters is in the village of Bethlehem. Now, when you think of Bethlehem, you may have thought of a geographical village at first, but there's more there than that. There's the visitors, like Joseph and Mary, who are coming there because they were called there to be for the census. There's the innkeeper, who all we know about him is that he says there is no room in the inn, so the innkeeper is assumed. There's the residents of Bethlehem, those who live in Bethlehem regularly and that's their hometown, and they're not traveling there. And then there's the mourners in Bethlehem. So you have four groups of people in Bethlehem. And so when we look at those, we can gain a little bit better look at the Bible story when we think of them. Now, history records that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, just the way that the prophet Micah said it would happen nearly 700 years earlier. Now, presently there's about 30,000 people living in the village of Bethlehem, but that's not the way it was when Christ was born. Then the best research tells us, as archaeologists have dug down and seen the size of the city by the foundations of the buildings, that there were probably about 300 to 1,000 people who lived there. Bethlehem was an unwalled village, a village of very little significance. The town's name literally meant the house of bread, referencing probably the fertile soil and the agriculture that took place in the area. Now, it was an unwalled city in biblical times. It would be unprotected during times of war, which would explain why it hadn't grown. Remember, when a neighboring army came in, your enemy army came into town, you would flee to the city that had walls like Jerusalem, and that's where you'd be protected. But Bethlehem wasn't like that. It was an unwalled city. So the population of Palestine during Jesus' time was approximately 500,000 people. So think about that for a second. All of these people are moving. The visitors are coming, and they're moving from the north to the south and the south to the north during this census because they needed to go to their hometown to be registered. Now, we don't know much about the visitors, but we do know what it's like to feel displacement, don't we? And we know that those visitors sometimes stayed in the town in which they were called to for a longer period of time. Like, for instance, we know that when the wise men came, the Magi come to Bethlehem, they come nearly 2 years later, and we can reckon that because Herod, you may remember, said that all the children 2 years and younger should be killed. So we know that Joseph and Mary had been there for a significant period of time. So when people registered in these various towns, it wasn't unusual for them to stay, find work to do, and stay for a while. Now, a prof of mine in college once said that the best commentary on the scripture is a sanctified imagination. So let's imagine some things that would have been going on in those travelers' minds. These are the visitors. Remember, we have the visitors, the innkeeper, the residents of Bethlehem, and the mourners. One of the things that would be going on in the visitor's mind is that they would have felt probably a spirit of discontentment. Nobody likes to be displaced, being uprooted from your home, as all these people are coming from village to village, and they're all pouring into a village of 300 people. You can feel the frustration, can't you? We in our era have known some supply chain issues, but it would have been nothing like this. These villages swelling with massive, much larger populations. You can feel the frustration in housing. We don't know where we're going to stay. You can feel the frustration in food. You could feel the price rising and all of those things because there's so much demand. It was expensive. There were shortages. You would have known discontentment if you were a visitor. You also would have probably known anger. We know this because we see in the rest of the Gospels that the Jews didn't like the Romans telling them what to do. They didn't like the Roman military presence in their community. In fact, the Zealots, one of those groups of Jewish people, had no problem raising up arms and attacking the Roman occupation, even if it brought about their death. And finally, you would have noticed that as those visitors came to town, there would have been discontentment, there would have been anger, but there also would have been a nature of factiousness or fractions. We know that during the time of Christ, there were at least 4 different parties that didn't get along. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. All had different political opinions, all had different agendas, all had different solutions. None of them liked to get along. Now, for just a moment, imagine into that environment, Picture Mary and Joseph traveling down from Nazareth. All of that angst around them, discontentment, anger, divisiveness, complaining. And I just want you to know that it wasn't a silent night. It wasn't a peaceful candlelight service. It had all the confusion of the world in which we live. Now, let's move momentarily from the visitors to the innkeeper. Again, he is unspoken in the story. All we know is that there was no room in the inn. If I was an innkeeper in that environment, these words probably would have described me. Busy, frustrated, sometimes wishing I could do more, tired and weary. When it comes to the innkeeper and what we can learn about him, I remember years ago hearing the story of a young Down syndrome child who played a part in a Christmas pageant. His name was Wally. And here's how the story goes. And if you've ever seen a children's Christmas pageant, you kind of know it feels hallmarkish, right? It feels like it just gives you kind of a warm feeling to watch the kids live out the story. But Wally in the story teaches us another truth. He was about 9 years old. He struggled because as a Down syndrome child, he loved people, but he struggled sometimes to capture longer lines or memorize his lines. And so Christmas season came, and Wally was delighted to discover he was chosen to play the part of the innkeeper. The director reasoned that Wally only had one line, and she thought that he could do that one line. Now the big night comes, and all the children are excited, but there's one character that's especially excited. Wally is captivated by the storyline. And even though they practiced, when the actual moment comes, the director was concerned that Wally might forget his spoken lines, but Wally steps out on the stage as the innkeeper, and he announces to Mary and Joseph, "Be gone, there is no room in the inn." Now, the 7-year-old little Joseph looks back at Wally and expresses to Mary that his wife, Mary, is great with child, and then there's this awkward silence as Wally struggles with what to say next. He knew his line, but he couldn't bear to send Mary and Joseph away again. And you can almost picture it, right? Here is Wally, this Down syndrome child. He's forced to say, "Be gone" again, but he doesn't want to. And so with tears in his eyes, he blurts out, "Be gone." Now Joseph begins to exit the stage, and this is where the pageant becomes different than all others. Wally never left the stage. And you can see the director getting a little nervous. How's she going to get Wally off the stage? But Wally's mind is racing for a creative alternative. And then finally, with a big smile on his face, he signals that the innkeeper had come up with a room for Joseph and Mary. And he says, "Wait, Joseph." And everybody watches, and Wally blurts out, "You and Mary can have my room." And the audience laughs and then grows silent. And they understand that Wally has found the solution that all of us need to have. Wally had made room for Jesus. The innkeeper in the story doesn't make room for Jesus. Wally had. The visitors coming into the city would have known angst and frustration and anger. Those are the lessons we learn from the visitors to Bethlehem and from the innkeeper in Bethlehem.